great day to be alive. And the Seven Cities Forums of Hampton Roads presents Portsmouth Coffee Talk. And with Leah Drake Stick, Thomas the Colonel Chapman, and yours truly, James Slim Overton. And good morning, host. How you doing?
Good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Slim. How y'all doing? All y'all.
Let everybody know this is the reason we're here. We got our coffee and we're
have our coffee.
That's it.
Well, thank everybody on WGPL, Joy 1350, listening to us on the radio, and those watching us on Facebook Live, on Leah's Facebook Live, or our business station, which I requested everybody go to, the Hampton Roads Seven Cities Forums, LLC. So this morning, and well, I want to say first, we lost Cicely Tyson a few days ago, which is the queen, and she was one of those people that, and we know how resilient our Black women are, and she was one of those people at 96 that worked all the way up until she said she wasn't going to retire. And she held true to that. She was promoting a book, and even up to about 24 hours, before she passed away, she was out there promoting that book. And so we celebrate her life. She's now an ancestor. She's a part of, she was always a part of the history, but now she's an ancestral part of our history. So we just wanted to mention that, everybody, you know, for me, with her work and everything like that, and we just wanted to give her praise and glorify her as we move on. So we start the Black History Month off today, and we're going to talk about, since we're Portsmouth Coffee Talk, we want to talk a little bit about some of the people in the city of Portsmouth that made significant strides that helped us as a race have a better quality of life. And who better to do that with this morning? We have Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
We're doing great, and thank you so much for coming on. We knew we could get you on. You would be a wealth of information all over, but especially here in the city of Portsmouth. Because of that book you co-authored with May Haywood Breckenridge?
Yeah, Breckenridge Haywood, yes.
Breckenridge, it's early in the morning, so thank you for that correction. But anyway, you co-authored that book that sort of chronicalized the history of Portsmouth from the eyes of Black African-Americans and their achievements. So before we go to that, let people who don't know, that been living under a rock for maybe 2 or 3 years, that don't know you and don't know what you do. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Professor of History, and Director of Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Disposal, did I pronounce? Diaspora, thank you. Studies. And hopefully you can go into that a little bit, because that's sort of African.
It's a connection to Liberia.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And at the great Norfolk State University, behold.
The green and gold.
Amen. Green and gold.
Yes.
But has authored many books and published, the latest being The Virginia Waterways and Underground Railroad. Of course, I mentioned the Black American series of Portsmouth. She has, and she's been awarded over $800,000 in grants. And you don't get that kind of money unless you
know what you're doing.
That you will use it wisely and bring up some research that would be beneficial to all. She is also the co-chair of the Virginia Commission on African American History Education. Very important as we go forward, trying to make sure our students are aware of our contributions and starts in the elementary stages. And that was established by Governor Ralph Northern. And I have a long list of accomplishments, and I can't go over all of them. That has to be another show. But as we go along, I will probably mention some of the things that you're involved with that will make the connection with some of the things you'll talk about today. So Leah, I'll let you, well, not let you, but will you please start off the conversation with Dr. Newby?
I certainly will. And I am excited to be here this morning with Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. I did have the privilege of working with her. I think I didn't realize that was back in 2015.
Yeah.
We did the piece on the colored museum, colored library, and how it became a museum. And we worked together on that project. So I would really hope that you would start with the Emmanuel Church and the Underground Railroad, if you would.
I would be absolutely delighted. And thank you so much for bringing me here. I did want to say that the word diaspora is really in reference to the going out. So you have Africans who were forcefully removed from the continent, and they were scattered throughout the world, but especially in Europe and the Americas. But also the diaspora has been a voluntary one for people of African descent. So some have, even long before the Europeans could sail the seas, Africans were sailing, and many dispersed to what we call Polynesia, Micronesia, India, throughout Europe, Africa, throughout the continent of Africa, Europe, and even the Americas. We know, for example, that there were Africans who arrived long before the Europeans came to the Americas. They were seafaring peoples in some nation states. Mali, for example, the Empire of Mali, as well as the Empire of Songhai. And so we've also had Africans who have, or people of African descent who have returned to different countries in Africa, such as African Americans who helped establish the nation of Liberia. There were some who moved to Canada and helped to establish villages and towns throughout the area of Ontario. And so people of African descent have really helped to establish places throughout the world. And so the diaspora studies is really positioning people to understand that a little bit more. So going to your question about Emmanuel AME Church, which in the earlier period was called the Colored Methodist Society. That organization was established toward the end of the 18th century. These were people who were part of the Methodist Church, broke off, of course, and became the predominantly white Methodist Church of Monumental. But those of African descent wanted to have their own church, and they established their society on Washington Street in Portsmouth. And they were renting a building, and they had their own minister. Their congregation was growing. But around 1831, with the Nat Turner Revolt, white Virginians were so terrified of that they began to target, or they used that revolt to target free Blacks, especially, many of whom were very much involved with the Colored Methodist Society. And they forced them to have a white minister, and they forced them to come back to the church on Green Street and worship in that sanctuary. Meanwhile, the white congregation established another building, or erected another building, and that's where they were. And they continued in that building until around 1856, 57. And that's when their church, along with a lot of other churches that were tied up or tangled up or identified as somehow being a part of the abolitionist effort, the Underground Railroad, it was burned to the ground. And that's when they built a new church on North Street, which is currently where it is. And that church also continued to be associated with the Underground Railroad. And let me tell you what was really interesting. There are a couple of things that are really interesting about that church. One is that the church had a lot of objects in it that were from Liberia.
Yes.
Because there's a connection between the free Blacks in Portsmouth, who then went over to Liberia as missionaries. And they weren't trying to resettle a place in Africa. Rather, they were trying to create a very powerful nation state that would provide the leverage that they needed to have someone advocating for them in the world. And so they knew that people in Liberia who were already on that land, and there were about 5 different tribal groups in that region, they knew that those individuals needed to be oriented towards European society, and the best way would be to teach them about Christianity. And so many went over as missionaries, but their purpose was to help orient them so that they could become very familiar with how Europeans did business, because it was through the church that they did business. And so the congregation had, for example, they have lighting fixtures that were actually created by those from Liberia that they shipped to that country, to that church in the 1850s, the latter part of the 1850s. And they also had some other objects in that church that came from Liberia. And Liberia, by the way, was originally a colony, and a lot of people think that the American Colonization Society, which was a white organization, helped to found Liberia, but they really didn't. There was a man who was born in Norfolk whose name was Joseph Jenkins Roberts.
Yes.
He was the one, along with his family, who moved to Liberia in the 1830s. He became the first Black governor and then led the nation to its independence, writing the argument for how and why they could declare themselves independent. And that statement that he wrote still remains today recognized by international law as the guide for how nations can become independent. And so a lot of the African Americans, they were later called Afro-Liberians, who were in Liberia. They were the ones who helped to provide a lot of leadership. Of course, we know that anytime you colonize an area, that you run the risk of dominating, and the people in that region will eventually rise up against you. And that's exactly what happened in Liberia, that a lot of the Afro-Liberians who kept control of the politics and so forth, they were overthrown by the people who were originally from that area. So you have some intermixtures, but you know, a lot of them ended up fleeing back into the country. And interestingly, we have a lot of Afro-Liberians living in our area. Whether or not some of their family members originally came from here, we don't know. But we do know that Portsmouth also has a lot of Afro-Canadians, because a lot of people from this area left aboard British ships at the end of the American Revolution and during the War of 1812. And some of their descendants are still in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And some of them have actually returned and have actually tried to reconnect. In fact, they've noticed that a lot of the people in Portsmouth look just like their relatives. So they believe there is still a genetic connection between themselves and people in Portsmouth. But going back to your original question about Emmanuel AME Church, before it became known as Emmanuel AME Church, that was a church that seemingly had independent thinkers. These were people who gathered together, and they were very strong in their perspective about their independence and their perspective about freedom. And what's interesting is that the white ministers who were appointed to oversee the Black people actually allowed, without any obstacle, it seems, they allowed the people to organize, not only to help others escape, but to create a network in that church. And so without betraying them, I'll put it that way. And so some of the people, in fact, in the 1840s, one of their ministers actually wrote in the order book that a lot of their membership numbers had decreased, not only because of death, but because so many escaped. And so there are some people that we found out about. And one of them in particular was a man by the name of Robert Irving. And Robert Irving was married to a woman by the name of Rebecca. And the two of them, they knew each other. They were members of Emmanuel AME Church, along with another woman by the name of Clarissa Davis, who, along with her father, William Davis, her mother, presumably, although she died before the 1850s, and her brothers, William and George, they all lived in this small community, and they were all part of Emmanuel AME Church while it was known as the Colored Methodist Church. And it was in 1854 and 1855 that many of them escaped. And this was right around the time, 1855 was right around the time of the yellow fever epidemic. And this was also a time period when a lot of whites were died from the fever, as well as a lot of Blacks. You know that the Norfolk port was one of the largest on the East Coast. In fact, some recent research has found that Norfolk was probably the largest departure point on the East Coast for the domestic slave trade. So many of the people left from Norfolk forced to go to the lower South. So Charleston and New Orleans were two big ports that they were taken to. But Norfolk, the Norfolk port, was also the what's called the southern depot of the Underground Railroad. So while you had thousands who were leaving from the Norfolk port to go to a harsher form of slavery, you also had thousands leaving the Norfolk port going to freedom. And so it's kind of an interesting place. And a lot of people passed through Portsmouth coming from the counties in Virginia and North Carolina, some passing through the Dismal Swamp to get to the Norfolk port. It's called the Norfolk port, although of course the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth shared that port. And all along Effingham, Crawford Parkway, as well as Water Street, excuse me, not Water Street, but High Street, North Street, those are areas that had boarding houses, and a lot of the ship's captains and pilots and so forth would board in places. There were hundreds of ships that were constantly in and out of the Norfolk port. And so you had places like the Crawford House, which was a big tavern and boarding house that had a woman by the name of Eliza. And Eliza was one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad. And we know that because one of the people who escaped had a father who actually gave an account years later of how he found out where his daughters were. One of them was in Portsmouth, and it was because of this woman, Eliza, because she was part of a whole network of conductors and station masters on the Underground Railroad who communicated with each other. And because she worked at the Crawford House, she knew all of the ship's captains, she knew the stewards, she knew all these individuals, and she also knew all these people at Emmanuel AME Church. And so going back to Robert, Robert had to, he actually married, he was married by his wife's owner who lived on North Street. And he talked about in his account that the owner married them inside the house, and he prepared his wife's dinner. They were allowed to live in the basement. And that wasn't necessarily a great thing because the basement was a dirt floor. Yeah. And in Portsmouth, the first floor in downtown Portsmouth was, the water table was so high that that was a very damp area. So most people actually lived on the second floor. But that's where he and his wife lived and had 3 children. But his owner, who rented him out to the Naval Hospital in Portsmouth, and he worked along with his father there, his owner decided she was going to sell him, and that's when he escaped. And he tried to get his wife and children, but her owner, John Hodges, who was a general, he distinguished himself during the Mexican War. He put his this man's wife and children in the slave jail in Norfolk. And so Robert couldn't get to his family and actually hung around Portsmouth until February of 1855. And finally, because he was afraid he was going to get captured, he left, passed through the Philadelphia station. And so we know about him because of William Still, who was he was a station master, and he kept copious notes of everyone who passed through his station. And then he eventually went up to New Bedford. And New Bedford was a city teeming with fugitives. There were so many fugitives in New Bedford that Frederick Douglass chose New Bedford as the place to organize the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, because he knew that the people who would fight the hardest were those who escaped themselves or their parents escaped. And so that's why he chose New Bedford. And that's where Robert Irvin, who changed his name to Sheridan Ford, escaped. And we have these letters, which he wrote to William Still pleading, "Do you know what happened to my family?" And no one could tell him what happened to his family. And he had 2 friends, one free Black, one who was enslaved in Portsmouth, that he corresponded with. So you had Black people who knew how to read and write. Yeah. And they were doing so secretly and sending letters. That's why the mail service is so important. That's the only service that was established by the Constitution. And so he did all of these things. And of course, eventually he gave up. In 1863, he decided to give up, and he married another person who escaped from Portsmouth named Clarissa Davis. 2 years later, he got word after the end of the Civil War that his wife had returned to Portsmouth, but she thought she would never see her husband again either. And she had remarried. And so I know all of this information because I found out that after he died, his children from his second marriage and from his first marriage were expecting to share. There was an expectation that they would share in his estate, because Sheridan Ford, when he died, a man who escaped from slavery, owned 2 houses. He died in 1897. He had $1,200 in the bank in 1897. That was tantamount to having $50,000 in the bank. He even owned a piano and gave gold watches to all of his children, and he had 5 children. Unfortunately for his son, Frank, who was still in Portsmouth, he lost the case. But fortunately for us, the court depositions tell us his story. And so we know that Sheridan Ford came back twice to Portsmouth. And the second time he came back, he gave a gold watch to one of his sons who's still living in Portsmouth. and say, take this. It's, you know, it's nothing common, meaning it's very expensive. And one day you will inherit my property. And then he said, son, I can't come here anymore. It's too painful. Mm. And then he turned to his first wife and he said to her, in 1895, had I not been forced to leave this year, we would have celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. Mm. And he returned back to New Bedford, and 2 years later, he died. And those kinds of stories are so important. Well, there's a family who currently lives in the house where Sheridan Ford and his wife were enslaved. And they tracked down the children, the descendants of Sheridan Ford and his first wife. And about, I think it was 6 years ago, that family came to visit and stayed in the house where their ancestors were enslaved, and went to Emmanuel AME Church and worshiped in the same church that their ancestors worshiped in. And so they found out about their family that they had no knowledge of. And so it's stories like that that are exciting, that tell us about resilience and determination, and that tell us that people did not accept their situations, that they fought, whether it was like Eliza, who served as a conductor, who helped so many people escape, but died herself during the yellow fever epidemic, or people like Sheridan Ford, who found a new life in another place, but still remembered his hometown of Portsmouth. Those are the stories that I think we have to remember. It gives us encouragement and it gives us a fortitude.
That was amazing, because his outcome with his family reminded me of 12 Years a Slave when he got back to his family. So, I mean, that's such an interesting story. But to go back to Joseph Jenkins Roberts.
Yes.
I have on my Liberian shirt because I knew you would talk about Liberia, because I have a connection. I was blessed to go 3 times to Liberia and went to the area where those who had departed from this area, where they landed. In fact, we went and kneeled in the place where they had landed. So I've invited my Liberian friends to come aboard so they can hear all that you have to say. But the knowledge is so great about Emmanuel, and many haven't been into the church, but they need to go inside the church and you can get the feel of the history inside Emmanuel Church. And I just thank you so very much. And before my guides come on, I want you, if possible, you know, we talked about the Colored Museum and how you've changed the Colored Library into a Colored Museum. And we worked on that project together with individuals who were involved. Can you share a little bit with us about the Colored Library?
I would be delighted. You know, Portsmouth has been an interesting little town and little city. It for a great deal of its existence, it was 2 square miles. Mm-hmm. And so by the time you get to where Emmanuel established itself, that was actually just over the border of the city of Portsmouth. And so everybody in that city knew each other. Everyone was related to each other. And for whatever reason, the whites of that city, while you had a handful who were sympathetic, the majority were not. The majority were very, very hostile to especially free Blacks. And they were hostile in so many ways to the enslaved people. There are lots of stories of a harsh treatment of enslaved people. And a lot of them sold them away, sold them through the domestic slave trade, not just to people in the area. And so there was a high degree of people running away because of that treatment, because of that environment. But what I find to be really, really interesting is that even in all of that, people of African descent pushed. And so you had people like Wilson, whose family, he was in fact, I love to show the picture of Wilson and his slaveholder, because Wilson, who started the colored notes in Portsmouth, it was a column in the Portsmouth Star where he talked about what went on in Portsmouth. He talked about the fight for freedom, and he talked about the Underground Railroad. He actually had a brother who escaped through the Underground Railroad, who eventually ended up moving to Canada and then later to California and worked at the newspaper that was owned by William Randolph Hearst. And Wilson actually visited him in California. And then you had others who continued to talk about the community in Portsmouth. And so Blacks were pushing for their freedom, and they were pushing for equality. And so by 1845, the city of Portsmouth that refused to have African Americans have a decent school or have a decent community, they eventually capitulated and allowed them to have a library, because the public library was not really public. It was for whites only.
Exactly.
And so Black people pushed to have this library. And Bertha Edwards, who looked, up until the day she died, she looked like a little girl. She was perhaps one of the brightest, most talented minds I have ever encountered. This woman knew everybody. And she would look at a picture that was 60 years old, identify everybody in that picture, their children, who their children married, and their children's children's children. And she would tell you what year they married. And, you know, I was in awe of this woman. Well, she became the first librarian. And she was the one who organized efforts for Blacks to get registered to vote, because Virginia did not want Blacks to vote, and created all kinds of crazy ways that Blacks couldn't vote, like the blank ballot. And this was adopted by most of the cities and counties in Virginia. And the blank ballot was that they would show you what your registration ballot had to include. There were about 20 items on that ballot. And then they would hand you a blank piece of paper. And you had to complete the 20 questions with this blank piece of paper. And so she would have sessions in that library that helped people to remember step by step by step what they had to write on this blank ballot to get registered to vote. And she was very successful in helping people. That was just one of the many things that the Colored Library did. And Ebenezer Baptist Church, when the library closed in the 1960s because of the Civil Rights Act that said, no, you cannot continue the separate and so-called equal, of course it was never equal. And so that library closed because it was very small for a population that was almost half of the population in the city. To have a tiny library where there were several branches for the white population, of course, that was totally unfair. And so that library closed, but Ebenezer decided they wanted to preserve that building. And they brought that building to their site, to the church site. And they utilized it for the Boy Scouts to meet in and for all kinds of things until they finally closed it down, but they never destroyed the building, because they wanted to remember. And then some of the people at Ebenezer and throughout the city decided they wanted they felt it was the city's responsibility to preserve this history. Because one of the things that we saw happen throughout the South is we saw whites erase the harm that they did to Black people, at least visually. They eliminated all the slave cabins. They eliminated all of the white only, Black, Negro only or colored only signs. They erased the whipping posts and all these objects that would let us know about the horrendous inequities in society. They tried to erase these images, such as the colored library, to try to create this false narrative that somehow we've all been equal.
Mm-hmm.
But Black people in Portsmouth said, no, we're going to preserve this. This is important to our history and our memory and our community. It was something that we utilized to help us to be free by opening the minds of our young people about knowledge, teaching about Black history, helping people to get registered to vote, helping to organize our community in many ways through the different organizations that would meet in that library. And so that library was so important that the African American Historical Society of Portsmouth got together and they pressured the city for years and used their funds and used fundraising opportunities to preserve that institution until finally Portsmouth made it into a museum. But of course, the battle is not over and there's more to be done.
And we have to give Mae Breckinridge Haywood a lot of credit for.
Oh, she was I would say that Mae Breckinridge Haywood has entered the annals of, of being part of history now.
Yes.
Because without her, that library, that museum would not have been preserved and would not have been created.
That's true. Yes.
That's a great history lesson, Dr. Newby. One of the things, it's always a good saying, is that if you don't know your history, then we will repeat the mistakes of yesterday. And we're seeing that. But I need to make this one little quick commercial for those out there in Etherland. And if you like what you're hearing today, we at Seven Cities Forum are looking for sponsors, or we'll take donations, and you can mail them to Hampton Road, Seven Cities Forum at P.O. Box 7664, Portsmouth, Virginia 23707. And so the other plug I'd like to give is, as we prepared for you to come on, and I was just thinking to myself, I had graduated Norfolk State actually 40 years ago this year in the nursing department. And I've seen changes because during the time, and I graduated from the nursing department, and where for Black male at the time, I was far, you never saw us. I only saw one other Black male, and there was another guy that was in the Navy that graduated with me. But now as time goes on, but what I'd like to say is, you talked about the Liberia, and we're going through history, and we talked about those inflection points in our democracy. And with that historical point, we had an inflection point where our democracy actually was at risk twice in our lives, major times, was the Civil War, and also the insurrection, the Trump insurrection, this recently in early January, where actually our democracy was really at stake. But when we go back to our first inflection point, the Civil War, what was the role of HBCU schools played in post-Civil War education of Black folks?
Well, you had schools that existed prior to the Civil War that were HBCUs, like Fisk and Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. But after the Civil War, you had others like Hampton and Howard. And those institutions were incredibly important in educating this cadre of professionals who would emerge in one generation. In fact, they're called Freedom's First Generation. And these were the physicians, the attorneys, the teachers, the business leaders, educators. These were the skilled artisans who opened businesses and became bankers in some cases, tailors, seamstresses. The explosion of professionals who advanced African Americans were the direct result of the HBCU experience. And that's why it saddened me a few years ago when I actually heard African Americans advocating for the closure of HBCUs with this nonsensical argument that, well, since they were created because Black people couldn't attend white schools, they're no longer of need. And I said, whoa, you have no clue what you're talking about. First of all, it's really bad when you speak ignorance out loud. And it's even worse when you popularize what is essentially not true. Go to a majority white institution, and the thing that you see is the culture that is promoted by that institution. When HBCUs were established, they were established to promote the culture of African Americans, to highlight the ingenuity, the creativity, the power of African Americans. And that is what they teach their students, to be proud of who they are, to know their history, and most importantly, to understand what they're capable of doing.
Yes.
And that is why HBCUs still today are responsible for training more Black professionals than any institution in the United States. So I hope I'm actually addressing, the issue about HBCUs, but, HBCUs have also helped to educate the intellectuals who helped to start the Black nationalist movement. And this is a movement throughout the world that looked at Haiti, for example, and began to talk about and help popularize the ideas of the Haitian Revolution and the Haitian intellectuals who laid the foundation for Black nationalism. Because the white world demonized Haiti. It demonized what happened in Haiti. It's the same kind of thing that you hear when you hear about the Nat Turner revolt. I've heard white descendants of those who were killed say, well, he killed my great-great-grandpappy. And my response is, well, what did your great-great-grandpappy do to the African Americans who were enslaved? Because your great-great-grandpappy was probably not innocent of not abusing or killing some of them. In fact, none of the states in this country, but especially in the South, criminalized killing Black people. In Virginia in 1669, they passed a law allowing for the, quote, casual killing of Black people if they resisted their owner. And so if you were a woman and you were being raped by your owner and you resisted, you could be killed and it was not seen as a crime. And so, we've had this kind of situation for many, many years. When you talk about who writes the history is actually more important than the history itself.
Yes.
Because how you interpret that history, the lens through which you write that interpretation, provides you with a positive, negative, or a wide variety of feelings about that incident. And so HBCUs have been very, very good in helping to train African American historians and people throughout the professions to interpret. In fact, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which helped to create Negro History Week, later Black History Month, that was a consortium of African Americans at HBCUs, of course, centered at Howard University, but you had people like Luther P. Jackson at Virginia State University and others who were very prominent in what we call ASALH, which is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And so HBCUs are really critical to all of that, and is critical to helping to start this whole field that we call African American history.
I tell you, and we do know, until the lion can tell his story, the hunter will always be the victor. So it's important that you know your history.
Excuse me, everybody, just for a minute. We have to end the radio station at 7 o'clock, and we will continue on Facebook Live our conversation. So thanks to everyone on WGPL 1350 Joy AM for listening this morning to our special guest. And we'll see you all next Monday when we'll have Dr. Keith Newby on to talk about heart health issues. So we will continue on. And with that, Dr. Newby, I want to get into the commission that you're on, the Virginia Commission of African American History Education. And it's the reason I want you to talk a little bit about the role of that commission, because it's so important. And in all the Hampton Roads school system, especially Portsmouth, that we teach what you're talking today to our African American students, as well as the white students, because when we had the issue with the monument,
yes,
I saw a lot of the white people sort of wanted to have a debate about the truth of the things that went on around that monument, like the whipping post and the slave trading. And that probably was brought on what you said earlier about they wanted to erase all that history, right? Taking down the signs. And by the way, some of those things are in the colored library, you know, like that no drinking water fountain. That's in there. So talk about the role of that commission. I mean, do they have any control over curriculum where they can do some things to add that into our school system's education?
Sure. So the commission actually finished this work this past summer, actually early fall. It was in September that we actually gave our final report. And then since then, we have had, those of us who were part of the leadership have had meetings. What we did was we had a two-part process. I was the chair of the part that looked at the standards. And we went through all of the standards of learning for social studies, which if you've ever read those standards, it's like, you know, this thick. And we had a subcommittee that was headed by Ed Ayers, who's a known Virginia historian. And he identified hundreds of technical edits and also identified some areas that we should push to have some new standards. And our subcommittee spent, I think we had 5 separate meetings where we met for 4 hours each time. And we talked about every single standard. We looked in detail at everything. And there was a lot that, you know, we could have talked about that was outside of our purview because our focus was on African American history. But we used the definition of a technical edit based on the Department of Education in Virginia. And we made recommendations. We made at least 120 recommendations to change the wording, the language, add individuals or add explanations into those standards. And Superintendent Lane wanted the school board of Virginia to review and approve these technical edits. And so we made a presentation to them. and answered a plethora of questions from that school board. And they approved every one of our technical edits with the exception of 2. And the 2 they did not approve, they said, these are not technical edits. We want these to be new standards. And so we were thrilled that that was accepted by that group. And we also recommended that when the standards are rewritten, that they be rewritten along looking thematically at 10 points. And one of those points, or some of those points, included the idea of freedom and liberty. Another was citizenship. Another point was colonialism. Another one was imperialism and nationalism. So, you know, all of these ideas, those are themes that need to be incorporated as we're looking at our nation's history, as we're looking at the Commonwealth's history, and making sure that children see these as well, not just, you know, like the kindergarten age, not just waiting until the 7th or 8th grade to be exposed to this. Children understand freedom. Mm-hmm. They understand what's right and wrong. They understand exploitation or abuse. And so why remove those ideas from their perception of American history? They should know that from the beginning. And so we made sure that even in the kindergarten standards, that some of that information is incorporated. Now that was the subcommittee I was on. We also oversaw the creation by WHRO that was awarded the contract to create the state's first African-American history class that's conducted online. And so we reviewed their syllabus. We reviewed, you know, we made recommendations about what resources to use, how they should approach each section. And I was asked, along with a couple of other historians, to actually help the teachers in the pilot group to really learn a little bit more, answer questions. So we're actually in the process of mentoring a lot of the teachers through that information. Then we had another subcommittee headed by Derek Aldridge on the professional development. So they're teachers who, of course, need to be taught. And as a result, there's a bill currently that the General Assembly is debating. It's with the Senate now. It was approved by the House. And, excuse me, is to do 2 things. The first thing is to mandate that every single teacher, whether it's in history or not, must complete a diversity workshop that teaches them about African American history. For those who are teaching history or teaching government, anything in the social studies area, they must complete at least a course. But it's actually, they have to receive a certificate, which is several courses together, that would. them with this knowledge so that they don't do stupid things in classes. Because, you know, it's in ignorance that you do stupid things. Like years ago, there was a teacher who wanted to have a slave sale. Yes. You know, so let's come up with some creative things and really insult people. You know, so the certificate program is designed to keep that from happening. So currently, that bill is going through the Senate now. And with the bill is not just the mandate, but it's the funding that would support that. Right. So the commission's work recommended that. It also recommended that the course, it was initially going to be half a credit, which we thought was insulting. And we said, no, it must be a full credit. And so it is a full credit. class, and we want to expand that because it is a very intense class. But that class eventually will be adopted so that every student in the Commonwealth of Virginia must complete that class before they graduate.
Good.
And so those are some of the things that the commission did. And just to tell you, it was the year before when Governor Northam had the event of his blackface come out.
Yes.
There were several of us from Norfolk State who reached out to the governor's office and said we would like to meet with the governor and some of his and some of the secretaries of different divisions. And we were proposing a plan because we believed that he could turn the, real negative press into something positive and make a difference that could be used as a model for the nation. And so one of the things that we recommended was a complete reworking of the standards of learning, which he accepted. We also said there are a whole bunch of laws still on the books that are discriminatory laws that should be removed. He agreed and created a special commission that removed over 100 laws that were discriminatory, that were still on the books. Even though they weren't enforced, they were still on the books. And in fact, one of the professors who oversaw that project, who was a co-chair, he said he was shocked. He had no idea that those laws were still there. And so the research, and he was a law professor, he said that the research that was done just floored him. He had no clue. And that commission was made up of attorneys and judges throughout the Commonwealth. And they were shocked by how many laws still were there. And there were a number of other things that we recommended, including this idea of pursuing equity as opposed to equality, because I have been a big opponent of this unequal funding of schools based on your property taxes. Mm-hmm. If we're really committed to educating our population, why should more people with more get more?
More, amen.
And African Americans there's been no redressing of the many, many years of underfunding. In fact, a lot of money was actually stolen by the Commonwealth from Black schools. In the 1940s, the Journal and Guide did an expose on the school funding, and they found that Virginia was taking anywhere between $2,000 and $30,000 a year from the different districts that Black taxes were paying, and they were taking that money from these different districts. So when I say 2,000, I don't mean 2,000 across the Commonwealth. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about 2,000 from the city of Portsmouth. Mm-hmm. They were taking from the Black schools and giving that money to the white schools. Excuse me. So it was hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars per year that were being taken from Black schools and given to white schools. And that money was never returned. And this went on for decades.
Thank God we had the teachers that we had in our Black schools.
Oh yeah.
And that shortage of funding, they made sure we were prepared.
Well, not only that, but most of the African-American teachers were more educated than the white teachers.
Yes.
And yet they were underpaid.
Yes.
That has never been redressed either. Mm-hmm. And they taught sometimes 4 times more students than the white teachers. Mm-hmm. So you would have schools like in Norfolk, you had what was the Armstrong School. That was the first school constructed for African Americans. Same thing happened at what became IC Norcom. The school was constructed for, say, 600 students, but you had 2,000 students attending that school. And the numbers were so high that they had to have 2 sessions. So they would have some students come in the morning and some students come in the afternoon.
2 graduations in the year.
Yes, which actually was a violation of state law that required a certain number of hours. So here you had Black students going to school half the time in an overcrowded situation, actually being, having a shorter year on top of that. And then the Black teachers horribly overworked, getting half the pay. And then they talk about a lack of Black wealth. Gee, I wonder why.
Why is that? Yes.
Yes.
So Dr. Newby, even with all that going on, and we're into, 15 minutes, but even with all that going on, we had some brilliant people, teachers, doctors, lawyers in the city of Portsmouth that even outside of their profession, they dedicate themselves to civil rights work. And all of us up here on the panel can remember how it was in the city of Portsmouth when we couldn't go to certain things. We couldn't, all of us were crowded into the Capitol on the weekend. The Capitol,
yes, indeed. Or the Lyrics Theater.
and that wasn't a bad thing. We had a good time. But they had 3 theaters downtown that we were not allowed to go in. And this was like in the 60s, not the 1800s. But we had a lot of people that dedicated their time and effort, volunteered their time and effort to make sure that that was changed right here in the city of Portsmouth, like all the other cities. But the city of Portsmouth has some champions out there doing the work.
Well, that's the that's the part of African American history that we need to make sure we teach, and that's why I wanted the standards of learning to change. I have felt that the standards of learning were designed to harm, not to help, not to educate. They were designed to hold back information and knowledge, and provide an argument for why school funding needed to be reduced. And we have seen the Commonwealth reduce its commitment to public education, where the Commonwealth actually provides less than 40% of the funding. And so I'm trying to understand, how is public education public when so little of your funding comes from the public? And so but yet we have managed to make sure that private schools continue to get public funding. In fact, NASMN, private school, wouldn't even exist if it were not for resistance to integration.
Exactly.
And so and you look at the infrastructure of that school now, and that was because of public funding. And yet the perspectives, the attitude, the culture of that school today reflects why it was created, to maintain segregation and to create an environment in which people feel entitled to be discriminatory. So that those perspectives continue and unfortunately, a lot of leaders have been, I'm not going to say kowtowed, but have been pressured to not speak about these things, to not be honest and open. Now, you all mentioned something earlier about, threats to democracy. I kind of have a different attitude, because when you focus on the Civil War and you focus on the Capitol riot as being a threat to democracy, whose democracy are we talking about here?
Yes, good question.
Are we talking about our national ideological democracy, Or are we talking about the unity of whites?
Mm-hmm.
And so the threat is not to democracy, it's to the unity of whites. Because the threat to democracy happened when America decided to become an independent nation and to embrace, we hold these truths to be acceptable, that all men are created equal, while we had an unequal society, and justified that inequality.
Yes.
So that was the biggest threat to democracy, is to starting a nation on the foundation of hypocrisy.
Right, right.
That's the biggest threat, is to maintain hypocrisy and not to admit that you began a nation with a lie.
But to follow on with that is that our Constitution should be a breathing document. And then so over time, it has adjusted for what is right with ending slavery, women's rights, da, 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 da. But then as whites have seen that, yes, their circle of power has shrunk, then that's what you see in their attempts to either stop us at the ballot box or actually take over the government by force. And so it's interesting there.
Oh, you mean take my country back?
Yes, take my country back.
Yes, and not allow anybody else to, just throw up everything. It's my country, and you should be, or blacks and brown people should be subservient. And I will always say that black women saved our country this year, because if
not just this year.
Historically, we have.
Throughout history.
Yeah. Well, the majority of people who have been the bulwark of any effort for freedom has been Black women. And that is not to take away from the leadership of Black men, but Black women have, because Black men have been killed, have been worked to death, Black women have had to step up. Black women had to take a role that society said women shouldn't take, because Black women they represented the enduring power of African American history and culture. And they took on themselves what most other women have not had to do. And have continued that, because the fight is not over. But I have to go back to something that I find to be absent today. And that is for so many Blacks to be part of this Make America Great idea. Where are our voices nationally? Why aren't you hearing these Black organizations? They're so quick. Oh, Kamala Harris, and they're so quick to jump up and lay claim to her. But where are the voices in saying, Black people, you need to wake up. You need to understand that you are not part of the Make America Great. You may join in the parade, but when it comes to entering the door, you are going to be left out, because this is not about you. This is about white supremacy.
Yes. You know what? And they've just substituted a red Make America Great hat, and they substituted that because they had the white Klan hat on.
Oh, yeah.
And then some Black folks got out there saying, yes, Black Republicans saying, I want to support this because we want to be big business. But as soon as they're done with you, you don't hear about them
Well, and these conservatives are not about big business. They're not about conservatism. They're about supremacy.
That's right. That's right.
And so for Blacks to jump on that bandwagon, for some Blacks to jump on the bandwagon is absolutely amazing. And I've heard people say the dumbest things like, you know, well, I thought Donald Trump was a great business leader. And I've had a few say that to me. And I said, really? On what are you basing this? On a television show? You know, I said, I'm not really clear. Did you not miss all of these reports?
Yes.
This man, you know, destroying every single business that he has owned. Exactly. You know, and they look at you stupidly like, oh, you know, I didn't know that. Really? You didn't know that? Well, how do you know the other thing? You know, what are you listening to? Mm-hmm. But there's something about
said all that was fake.
Oh yeah. You know, but you know, there's a machismo that I think some Black men crave, but it's false. It's a false machismo that does not include you in that.
Right.
But I don't hear the voices of African Americans speaking up. We talk to each other, you know, but to speak out nationally, where's the NAACP? Mm-hmm. You don't hear their voices.
Crickets, nothing.
Where's the National Black Baptist Association and the AME Church Association? Where are these national voices? They're muted if they're even out there. Mm-hmm. And then you've got all of these Black evangelicals along with the white evangelicals that are on this so-called conservative bandwagon. And you know, my position is, please stop talking. Because the Bible that I read doesn't say, well, this sin is worse than that sin.
That's for sure.
I didn't get that. You know, maybe that's a part of the Bible that got left out of the one I own. But you know, I heard something, or I read something in the Bible that talked about love.
Yes.
Love is patient, love is kind. You know, I didn't read all this other stuff that some people are reading. And there's a buying in.
That's because they were reading it upside down.
But, you know, I don't hear these voices. You know, there should have been a groundswell of condemnation towards people such as 50 Cent. Mm-hmm. When he came out, well, you know, I support him because, you know, he's good for my pocketbook. Mm-hmm. It's like, really? You know, are you really that low class? Are you really that petty? That, you know, you only see this is where ignorance is truly dangerous. Because your ability to earn this kind of money is because of the sacrifices of those who were advocating something else.
Right.
And those sacrifices you clearly are too ignorant to know about. But I don't hear that. I don't hear a peep from what I consider to be the Black leadership. I think that there's an absence. And that absence is because sometime in the 70s and 80s, and you can almost document it by looking at Ebony and Jet magazines, that the attention turned from the intellectual leadership to the entertainment industry.
Exactly.
And the money and the influence, not even influence, but the money. And of those who are part of that world.
Right.
And look at the car that they have and the house that they have, rather than what are we doing in our
that takes your focus off what you need to do and focus on those material things that they have.
Yes.
So, and that's what's happening with our kids. Our
Yes.
kids are focusing so much on material things. They have no knowledge of who they are, where they've come from, what contributions they've made to society, because they've taken us off our focus, taken us off our game, and we're losing in the long run.
And a lot of that change happened, I would say, in our educational system as we've changed over time. And I look at another inflection point when, say, when George Bush passed the Leave All the Children's.
Oh yeah, no child left behind.
Well, I said leave all the children behind because it really did. Because, you know, you talked about the African American history class, as that is an elective. That, I know when I came through, that was part of the regular class. We didn't have to force you to take that as an elective, but it was also in, everybody got a piece of it. And I think that that helped the inclusiveness of white America and Black and brown people, because we all got the same piece. And then how we use it, you know, we may have white folks had parents out there that were segregationists or whatever, but at least their kids got a little taste of it in the classroom. They've taken that out of the high schools. And I look at my grandkids now, and my son, when he was coming through, they've gutted history and African American history. They've gutted that over time, and that's leading to the problems that we having today.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, most people in America are so ignorant of history that you really have to start from scratch.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping, yes, I'm hoping that the Biden administration, with this new Secretary of Education, that he will be able to, him being an educator, will be able to make some changes with that, especially when you talk about funding private versus public. We need to put public money back in and take it away from the private schools and things like that, especially in the K through 12, and also no public money should be going to these private schools out here in the collegiate level.
Oh, absolutely. But you know, our society for a very long time, especially since the 60s, has demonized majoring in things like history, English literature, sociology, things like that. In fact, the STEM-only foolishness, and I call it foolishness, has really hurt us. You even have people saying, well, why are you majoring in art? Why are you majoring in music? You know, why are you these are things that are making millions and millions of dollars in our society, and yet we hear people demonizing them. You cannot substitute knowledge of history with a workshop. That is only going to talk about one particular thing, but you're not actually learning a lot. You're being introduced to information. And knowing about history gives you a perspective. It's like, how do you determine the value of knowledge? You can't. It is impossible to actually create a metric that would allow you to understand how you can measure the value of knowledge.
Yes.
And so it's the same thing in history, but your ignorance can actually be measured in what you support. If you are ignorant of something, now you've got people like Newt Gingrich, who's actually a historian. He has a PhD in history. So his stuff is just evil. But, you have people who really, truly are ignorant of something, and in their ignorance, they do certain things. In their ignorance, they are dismissive of the importance that knowing about human beings and knowing about different people's cultures and understanding their experiences play a huge role in whether or not a person in some cases succeeds or fails. We're telling people to get up and run a 400-meter race, and they have no legs because our society has crippled them so much so that they can't move forward. In both Portsmouth and in Norfolk, there are a number of schools that should be completely rebuilt. And they're all in African-American communities. We talk about seawater rising all the time in this region. The most vulnerable communities are not in the downtown areas, which is where all the money is going. It's in the Black areas. Those traditional Black communities that were purposefully located by law in low-lying communities. So where's the Black leadership in pointing out that? We are so busy trying to be accepted as part of the cadre of leaders. You can't be accepted. You can be used, but you cannot be accepted.
Wow. That's so true.
That is so true. And we're seeing that alive in the city of Portsmouth right now. They debate who's going to be the new city manager, where they're trying to put somebody up there that's probably got 6 hours of college credits if he could spell college.
They said 2 high school diplomas.
Yes, 2 high school. Oh Lord.
How in the heck do you have 2 high school diplomas?
I don't know how that occurs. I don't have a clue.
But we can be assured. I think I saw Dr. Whitaker go on our sister station and say publicly that part of the deal is dead. That's not going to happen.
I pray that's so.
We can take the focus off there and put it back where it needs to be.
Amen.
No, but you can't take the focus off because yes, you got caught. You got caught, and so you can't let it go because they'll just do it again in some underhanded way to do it. And those who
I didn't say
don't need to be there.
The focus, put more focus where it needs to be.
Yes.
The headlines take over the focus of things that need to be done in education and other parts of our city, then we're spinning our wheels.
Once again, you said we get sidetracked.
Yes. But we've gone way over the time.
We have.
Yeah. But that's okay, because the subject we're talking about, all of us have interest in, and Dr. Newby is contributing some things. Newby-Alexander is contributing some things that need to be heard. And we're going to have you back on, Dr. Newby, hopefully, to come on. And because we talked about this, we want to make sure we talk about the Norfolk Community Hospital that served our community so well. And the tape you sent me, remind me again of that Peninsula Hospital, the Black hospital.
Whitaker Memorial.
And when I was at Virginia Union, they had a community hospital, the Richmond Community Hospital.
Which still exists.
They're still there, which served our community.
Right, it is, I think, one of 2 traditional Black hospitals still existing in the country.
I didn't realize they were still around. Yes, thanks.
Yeah, they're partially owned by Bon Secours because back in the 1970s, that's when a lot of Black hospitals closed because the laws began to change for, as insurance companies took over and prices skyrocketed. If you were not directly connected with, formerly what was an insurance company now became a healthcare company and corporation, they actually began to write the laws that benefited them. And so even the Medicare, Medicaid reimbursements were designed to help these for-profit and not-for-profit healthcare corporations, and began to directly hurt privately owned hospitals. And that's why, Norfolk General, for example, that was, owned by the city. And they actually had to surrender that hospital to Centera because Centera, was big and became this, this behemoth that took over just about all the hospitals, and even Bon Secours is having a hard time competing with, you know, with Centera and some of these other, so they're actually a dying institution. And so you've got, at least in Virginia, you know, Centera is the big behemoth, and they ironically are the ones responsible for the delivery of the vaccines. And gee, I wonder why we're having still problems in the Black, you know, for Black communities getting the vaccine, because you gave it to an institution that has issues with regards to equity. And so, you know, you cannot, Black hospitals competing against this behemoth was a losing battle, because they didn't have the deep pockets, they didn't have the political connections, and yet these institutions were critical to the health and well-being of the African American communities, not to mention employing, you know, thousands of African American professionals, not only, you know, in the business core, but as administrators, as physicians, as part of the healthcare work team. So, you know, we still, the struggle is still ongoing. It's just a different face.
And I tell you, and because I served on the board of Norfolk Community Hospital, and we really lost a jewel when we lost Norfolk Community Hospital. And it's something that we do need to talk about. And I know our time is running out. This has been so interesting. I got people saying, please have her back on, have her back on, have her back on, because we didn't get into the Jeffrey Wilsons, the Ida Barbers. We didn't get into that Washington Street corridor where that monument was, where the whipping post was. There's so much history in the city of Portsmouth. An hour doesn't give us time. And we've gone well over an hour, James.
I knew it was going to take more than one program in order for us to really cover what we really wanted to cover. And when Dr. Newby-Alexander started back in the 1800s, that set a foundation for us. No, I mean, I really appreciated that. I wasn't expecting that to go back that far, but you have to set that foundation.
You do.
There before you can get to and move your way up to the point that we are today. That's the way you educate people. And that's the way it needs to be in our school system. Hopefully, you know, we can work on getting that and start, like you said, Doctor, start with our young kids. I mean, people think, oh, their minds can't take that. Oh, you know,
oh, yes, they can.
My granddaughter now, she's 2 years old. I think she's ready.
Well, you know, my father was a physician and my mom had been a teacher before she had my brother, and then she became a teacher to us. And as a child, I actually sat there and read a lot of my father's medical journals. And while my brain was not comprehending half of what I was reading, it stuck in my head. And by the time I got into junior high school, I had a wealth of knowledge about medicine that I didn't remember where it came from. But it was because I actually sat there and I was reading things. And so it took my brain some years to catch up with what it had consumed. But that's, you know, we have this notion that children, because they don't have the vocabulary, don't understand. But I'm a big believer in exposing your children to a wealth of knowledge at a very early age. It's not necessary that they have the vocabulary at that time, but exposing them, their minds absorb it and compartmentalize it in their brain. They don't forget it. And once the vocabulary catches up, then they have this knowledge, and they may not remember where it came from, but they have this knowledge. And so I'm a believer that we underestimate the capacity of even a baby to understand.
Yes.
And you know, Dr. Newby, that was one of the reasons back in 1997, I started my youth group, Sankofa Cultural and Learning Center. And I took these young people and exposed them to places of their history. We traveled to Selma, we crossed the bridge, we went to all of the places where history took place for African Americans. And then we were able to not only, I had those kids in 1997, then I ended up with their children. I had one mother who crossed the bridge in Selma at the 25th anniversary, and then she crossed again with her son, who was a part of the organization, for the 50th anniversary.
Wow.
So exposure is everything. Our kids have not been exposed.
Right.
And we need to expose our children to their history.
And I'm also a big advocate of returning field trips to the schools. Yes. When they eliminated that, they harmed
That's right.
our young people, because most of our children have not gone to these sites.
Exactly. Exactly.
And Leah, just remember, think how it would be during the times we were coming up and we had to make that trip in the 4th grade, I think, to Jamestown
and Williamsburg.
Suppose it was like it is today, where they have slaves and they have Black folks there. We didn't see any of that when we went there. But now they have the slavery.
Oh, yeah.
Black folks.
Because Colonial Williamsburg had 50% of their population was Black.
That's right.
The majority of the skilled artisans in that city were Black.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they erased us. They erased us from existence.
You know, and many years ago when I took my kids there and they were telling the history, and I said, wait a minute, you're not telling these children the correct history. We were asked to leave.
Really?
When we asked questions about the true history of Williamsburg, we were asked to leave.
Wow.
Because they didn't want to do that in front of their white audience.
The only experience that I remember from going to Jamestown was a goat eating my shoes. So, I mean, I didn't learn anything else. That I looked at a goat was eating my shoes.
Wow.
And I remember that today, but nothing else.
Nothing else.
So,
oh my goodness.
So that's kind of bad, you know. So we have to improve on that. But we must end now. But Dr. Newby-Alexander or Cassandra, we're going to have you back. And
we have to.
Maybe creating a series of you coming back. I know you're in demand all over C-SPAN and which I wanted to throw in there and other places, but hopefully you can spare a little time for us as we try to reach people that might not see some of those shows. So we will continue talk about our Black histories, our Black doctors, our Black lawyers, our Black physicians.
Our Black judges, Judge Overton.
Our Black judges and the ones that are living now. We had 2 judges come out of the same class of I.C. Narcombe, the class of 1970.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Came out of that class, Judge Morrison and Judge Kenny Melvin. And that speaks a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we need to talk about that. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for watching. And we will try to get as much of this on YouTube as we can. Leah, you know, we might have to slice and dice, but hopefully they'll take it all.
I hope it will. We'll try to convert it.
Well, we do have it all on Facebook Live, but we want to make sure we get it on YouTube.
Yes.
For more people to see.
Oh, this has been a great morning.
Yes. Any other comments from the other hosts before we sign off?
Yes. Just make a quick commercial here again.
Okay.
For those who are out on YouTube or either Facebook, if you like what you're hearing, like what you're seeing, you can send a donation or look at a sponsorship, and you can send it to HR or Hampton Road, 7 Cities Forum, P.O. Box 7664, Portsmouth, Virginia, 23707. And if you can give us a shout out, you can send an email to Slim. What's our email?
HR, Hampton Road, 7 Cities Forum at yahoo.com.
Yes.
And, send us an email. Let us know what you think, and let us know suggestions for future guests or subjects, and we'll try to oblige you. We want to get on more days of the week, hopefully, because we have so much information that we would like to share and make sure that our people are aware of what's going on.
Exactly.
So again, Doctor, we really thank you. Any closing comments from you?
Nothing other than Don't let someone else tell you your history.
Amen.
Read it, investigate it, and know that the richness of history is out there for you to discover.
Exactly.
Great point. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next week. Like I said, we're going to deal with the heart health issue, and our special guest will be Dr. Keith Newby. If the name sounds familiar, there's a connection there.
My younger brother, who I'm very proud of.
Yeah. So we're glad to have him on. I'm glad he agreed to come on and talk to us about heart health, you know, which is dear to my heart.
And dear to most African Americans' hearts as well.
Yes, yes. You know your history, and you know, it
know
can
your
be
heart health. Know your heart health. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
Thank
you, Dr. Newby. Thank
you so much.
Okay.
Let's not forget